Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's session. I am Kavya from Insight Pact. I will be ensuring that you all have a great experience with Zoom in the background today. I've just started the recording for this session and launched the YouTube Live. The session will begin shortly. You are at Building Back Better, Responsible Business Conduct, Human Rights and Environment. While we are waiting for the session to begin, I just have a few public announcements. The chat function is disabled for all attendees. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please make sure to send them through the Q&A section. You'll be able to see the Q&A button towards the bottom of your screen. This meeting is also being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. As I see new attendees coming in, hello everybody. Welcome, welcome. We're very excited to have you here. I'm Kavya from Insight Pact. I'll be working the backgrounds on Zoom today, making sure that everything runs smoothly. You are at Building Back Better, Responsible Business Conduct, Human Rights and the Environment. We will begin shortly. Just a few public announcements before we begin. The chat function is disabled for this webinar. If you have any questions for our panelists, please be sure to write them in the Q&A section of the webinar. You will be able to find that in the Q&A button towards the bottom of your screen. Also, just letting you know that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Building Back Better, Responsible Business Conduct, Human Rights and Environment. I will now hand it over to our moderator for today, Natalie. Natalie, off to you.
Thank you so much. And hello and welcome to everyone who tuned in. This is the session Building Back Better, Responsible Business Conduct, Human Rights and the Environment. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Natalie Harms. I'm the Marine Litter Focal Point in the Secretariat of the Coordinating Body on the Seas of East Asia, or Copsey. Copsey is an intergovernmental mechanism for the protection of the marine and coastal environment, and the Secretariat is administered by the United Nations Environment Programme here in Bangkok. So today, this session will explore business policies, tools, and practices that capture and address both environment and human rights impacts, risks, and positive contributions to both people and planet. This event is organized jointly by the United Nations Environment Programme, Unep, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNOHCHR. And we are speaking about this topic now and at this forum because COVID-19 has revealed the vulnerability of our global systems to protect the environment, our health, and our economies. And beyond direct health responses, fiscal stimulus packages and changing the way that we do business provide an opportunity for a transformational and green recovery. So fundamental to this change coming out of the pandemic will be decisive action by governments, businesses, and by all of us to address climate change, avoid habitat loss, reverse the loss of biodiversity, reduce pollution, improve waste management. And at Unep, we're working with these different stakeholders in the region to address environmental challenges in a way that benefits people and planet, as well as businesses. So today, we will look at examples from two of these environmental challenges, plastic pollution and climate change. And we'll also draw from two regional initiatives that Unep is currently working on with different partners. So one is that the Unep Regional Office and the Copsey Secretariat are jointly implementing a regional marine litter project called Sea Circular that promotes market-based solutions to reduce and prevent plastic pollution and strengthens evidence-based marine litter policies that also protect the rights of coastal communities and informal waste workers. And another project that we're drawing on that also we have a partner here today is the Empower project, which is jointly implemented by Unab and UN Women. And it works towards climate resilient societies with equal participation from women and men. And it demonstrates how renewable energy can be used as a tool for climate resilient livelihoods and promoting women's entrepreneurship. And both of these projects are supported by the government of Sweden. So I've said enough. I think let me move on and first introduce our speakers for this event. So first we will hear from two speakers who will set the scene for our discussion. They'll give us a bit more information on these different links that we want to speak about. We will start with Professor Surya Deva, who is a member of the United Nations Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And he's been working in business and human rights fields since the early 2000s. And then we will have Dr. Sarah Seck. She is an associate professor at the Schulich School of Law and Marine and Environmental Law Institute at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia in Canada. And after this scene setting, we will move to a panel discussion. So here we will share experiences and examples of good business conduct in the face of plastic pollution and climate change. Our first panelist will be Mr. Jan Wies, who's the Senior Public Affairs Manager at Nestlé, where he's in charge of social and environmental impact. Then we'll hear from Ms. Nalini Shikart, the co-founder of Hasiro Dala, an organization that works with waste pickers in Bangalore, India. And then we will turn to Ms. Smita Rakesh, who leads the Clean Energy and Climate Action portfolios at Social Alpha, which is an initiative to drive economic growth, social justice, and climate action. And finally, we will conclude our panel with input from Ms. Miyuki Zania, who is head of sustainable finance at the Daiichi Life Insurance Company and is responsible for environmental, social, and governance investing. And she'll tell us more about that. After the panel, we will also hear from our colleague, Ms. Stephanie Venuti, who is a policy advisor and legal expert at OECD at the Center for Responsible Business Conduct. And of course, then we will move into a Q&A session with you, our audience. So as already mentioned, please do send us your questions for the panel throughout the session via the Q&A function. And please state your question concisely and clearly, mention which panelist you are addressing if it's a specific question, and we'll try to address as many questions as possible. I'll mention this again later, but at the start of the Q&A session, we will also ask you to answer 3 questions through Mentimeter. So there's a link that will be shared with you in the chat. Or you can also go to www.menti.com and then type in the code, which is 882703. This will also be provided in the chat. Have a look there. If you like, maybe set this up already, then you're ready to go when we get to the Q&A. Please do note this session is being recorded. And with this introduction, I am delighted to turn to our first speakers who will set the scene for us for our discussion. So Professor Surya Deva, from the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. You have a special interest in developing rights holder-based approaches and exploring ways to hold corporations accountable for human rights abuses. So as our first speaker, you have this very important task today sort of to set the scene on the role of international instruments, global guidance and trends on the nexus between responsible business conduct, human rights and the environment. So can you please highlight what these key international instruments are, the global guidance and these interlinkages between human rights and the environment, and provide a few examples maybe of how these guidelines have been applied in the context of climate change. Over to you.
Thanks, Natalie, and hello, everyone. So I will try to answer a question in 3 parts. I will briefly explain for the benefit of everyone what is responsible business conduct, RBC. And then I will give some examples of the interlinkages between human rights, environment, and the climate change. Then I will briefly introduce the 2 key international instruments that are relevant for businesses to respect human rights, but also take care of the environmental issues and the climate mitigation aspect. And finally, I will talk about how to do it in terms of human rights due diligence and how that tool could be relevant. So what is RBC? So in simple terms, responsible business conduct is about managing adverse impact of one's activity. Like any other actor, businesses can contribute positively to society, but whenever they are doing any activity, any product or services they are selling or providing, in that process, it is inevitable that any business may potentially or actually cause some adverse impact on society. These adverse impacts could be classified in terms of human rights, labor rights. It could be about consumer rights, environmental rights, or it could be damaging the climate. Of course, there are other implications in terms of tax, anti-competitive behavior, and so on and so forth. But I would just stop at this list for now, because what it does basically mean that there are a range of interest of different stakeholders and rights holders in society that could be positively and negatively impacted. So basically, positive impact is good. That's what is expected. But responsible business conduct also entails managing your adverse impact. Now, I think we should not see these interests as separate compartments, that human rights is one compartment, labor rights is another, environmental rights and climate change, and so on and so forth. Rather, we should try to see the interlinkages and the interconnection between these different interests. For instance, if a business has a factory and the effluents from that factory are polluting a lake or a river, this will definitely result in water pollution. So a company may see this in terms of environmental pollution. But this water pollution would also have significant impact on human rights. Because let us say if a nearby community is drawing water from that river or lake, then it is very likely that this will have impact on right to health. It may potentially impact even right to life. So I think you'd see this connection between human rights and the environment. The second example I would like to take here is about climate change. Now, climate change is increasingly becoming a serious issue. And I think if we do not wake up, it could be something similar to COVID-19 in the future. And again, the real issue here is that, let us say climate change may bring in either there could be more cyclones, there could be flooding of the areas, or it could be drought, so it could have different implications. And all these implications will have a bearing on, let us say, right to food, because farmers may not be able to grow and all this. And that's why it is very critical that businesses take a holistic perspective and they integrate these considerations. Now, the second element I would like to cover is what are the relevant standards? There are several standards, but I would focus only on two key standards. One is the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and second is the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. OECD guidelines, some of you or most of you should know, were adopted originally in 1976. But the most recent update was in 2011. And I think that was the time when UN guiding principles were also adopted in 2011, June 2011. And I think there is this synergy between these two because UN guiding principles impacted this update of 2011 OECD guidelines. And they are kind of synchronized now in terms of human rights due diligence, which I will briefly mention very shortly. What is interesting to note, though, is that neither of these two instruments, though adopted or updated in 2011, expressly use the word climate or climate change anywhere. At the same time, the OECD guidelines have a complete chapter on the environment, which is quite crucial for businesses to understand what their responsibilities are. Now, in terms of the guiding principles, again, they don't expressly talk about environmental rights too much in great detail. But what is crucial is that they talk about additional standards that businesses may need to consider as part of Principle 12 commentary. And the second point we have to consider, which I already highlighted, is that there is interlinkages. So if businesses want to respect human rights, they cannot discharge this responsibility unless they also take into account climate change and environmental rights. And I think that's why it is absolutely critical that even if there is no explicit reference in UN guiding principles about the environment or climate change, these are absolutely interconnected. And to make this connection explicit, UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights is developing an information note to provide further guidance to governments and businesses and other stakeholders, and hopefully we'll have this out by the end of this year. Now, very quickly, final point is about what are the tools? I mean, there are many tools, but I would just focus on human rights due diligence, which is becoming the lingua franca in this field of business and human rights. So, and again, OECD has issued a very helpful due diligence guidance on this point. So businesses are expected to do 6 things. They should start with making a policy commitment. Then they should conduct a periodic ongoing human rights due diligence, which should be comprehensive, holistic. It has 4 steps. You identify some adverse impact. Then you try to integrate those findings into the actions you will take. You track your responses. And of course, then you should communicate what you have done and what you have achieved with your stakeholders. And finally, remediation. When we talk about environmental climate change issues, we often forget about remediation. I think we should not, because remediation accountability is equally critical. Accountability both of the government as well as the business actors. So I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for giving that information. I think that was quite comprehensive. There's a lot of tools and instruments out there that we can look at. I'd like to now turn to our second speaker, Ms. Sarah Sek from Dalhousie University. Sarah, you teach graduate students in the areas of environmental law, business and human rights, and international law. So can you also help us understand these linkages between environmental and human rights, supply chain vulnerabilities, and building resilience in COVID-19 recovery?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that introduction. Environmental rights problems are, of course, not new, but they're most certainly brought into focus by COVID-19. For example, it's well established that the loss of biodiversity is linked to a rise in zoonotic diseases in humans. At the same time, those who have health problems as a consequence of exposure to pollution are more vulnerable to viruses. While the shutdowns have led to temporary reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and better air quality, these, of course, very quickly bounce back to unacceptably harmful levels as economic activities resume. And problematically, some governments and industries suggest that the economic challenges arising from COVID-19 make environmental protection measures too expensive. These are old arguments about a tension between environment and development and environment and economy that really present us with what I would call false choices. So the real question is, who pays the environmental costs externalized by industry and governments? And the answer is those who are most vulnerable to environmental harms, who are often those who are most marginalized in our societies. These include the poor, racialized minorities, indigenous peoples, disabled, children, women, displaced persons and migrants, and even workers. These are problems that we can see and describe as environmental and climate justice problems, and they are very much violations of human rights. We also, it's very important not to forget about those who take on the task of defending the environment, because they are also often subject to egregious human rights violations. And so businesses must learn how to support environmental human rights defenders as part of their own independent responsibility to respect human rights. The work of several special rapporteurs on human rights and the environment, as well as Unep's Environmental Rights Initiative, confirmed that there is, in fact, a coherent vision of the relationship between human rights and the environment that is supported by a diversity of sources of international and domestic law, including many constitutional protections that are often overlooked. The Special Rapporteur David Boyd's Good Practices Report provides an excellent overview of state initiatives. For our purposes, though, and as expressed in the 2018 Framework Principles on Human Rights and the Environment, a key point is this: the environment and human rights are interdependent. Without a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, it is impossible to fully enjoy a vast range of human rights, including rights to life, health, food, water, and development. Yet at the same time, in order to protect the environment, it is vital to exercise human rights, including rights to information, participation, expression, and remedy. Moreover, A sustainable environment needs to be understood as including a sustainable Earth system. And so Special Rapporteur David Boyd is also elaborating on the content of substantive environmental rights through individual reports on clean air, safe climate, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, clean water, non-toxic environments, and healthy and sustainable food systems. Okay, according to Framework Principle 12, states should ensure environmental standards are effectively enforced against both public and private actors. But what about businesses? Paragraph 35 of the Framework Principles clarifies with reference to the UN Guiding Principles how this should work. So the responsibility of business enterprises to respect human rights includes the responsibility to avoid causing or contributing to adverse human rights impacts through environmental harm, to address such impacts when they occur, and to seek to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impacts that are directly linked to their operations, products, or services by their business relationships. Businesses should comply with all applicable environmental laws. They should issue clear policy commitments to meet their responsibility to respect human rights through environmental protection. They should, as noted by Surya, implement human rights due diligence processes, including human rights impact assessments, so as to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their environmental impacts on human rights. And ultimately, they must enable the remediation of any adverse environmental human rights impacts that they cause or to which they contribute. It's important to note that running through the framework principles is the idea of non-discrimination. This is a cross-cutting theme. Now, I'll conclude with these reflections. There are, as Surya has already noted, many responsible business conduct guidance tools, and many of them align with the UN guiding principles and integrate this idea of human rights due diligence. And many of them also reflect the Sustainable Development Goals. Among the best are the responsible business conduct guidance tools developed by the OECD. And most certainly these can help companies to integrate human rights due diligence into their operations and throughout their supply and value chains. But crucially for me in the human rights due diligence process, how we understand who the human is, who is the subject of rights, is to me somewhat key. I think attention to environmental human rights enables us to understand that we are all, in fact, what I call ecologically embedded relational human beings. So individually, we are all differentially vulnerable to ecological harms. And we're all also members of families and communities, and we have children and are in relationships with future generations as well. So ultimately, we are all part of and interdependent with the earth. And to ensure justice and resilience, I think this understanding of the human rights holder must inform business responsibilities. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I think that was very beautifully put, how we're all interdependent and ecologically embedded within this system. So let's keep in mind these interlinkages and how they work when we move into our panel discussion, which we'll do now. So I would like to start with our first panelist, who's Mr. Jan Wies from Nestlé. Jan, you're familiar with both the business world and the human rights space. So in the past, you were part of the team of the special representative of the UN Secretary General on business and human rights. So you've seen both of these worlds. Can you share with us an example of the business practices your company has undertaken in addressing plastic pollution, while at the same time ensuring the protection of human rights? What are some of the efforts that you'd like to share with us?
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to the organizers for inviting us to share our experience, but also the numerous challenges that we face in this area. Before I deep into plastics, let me just say a few words about our approach to due diligence overall. I think it's important in the context of this discussion. So we've had a human rights due diligence program in place since 2011, and this is fully aligned with the different standards that we've talked about already today the guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. As part of this program, and I'm not going to spend too much time, but as part of this program, we've made a number of progress in terms of like integrating human rights into corporate policies, including climate change policies or plastics policies, but also engaging with a full range of stakeholders and right holders, or training our employees, integrating risks into our enterprise risk management. So this is all part of what we do as part of our dedicated human rights due diligence program. And this is still running, as you know, we cover more grounds in terms of operations, but also supply chains. Now, importantly, as part of this program, we have carried out a number of dedicated human rights impact assessments. And since 2011, we carried 13 of these human rights impact assessments. Typically, these assessments have focused on high-risk countries and high-risk, what we call commodities or raw materials. So, for example, cocoa, coffee, or palm oil for us are key commodities and presents a number of risks that we wanted to better understand and better address, also like from a remediation perspective. Now, of course, of these human rights impact assessments, we cover the full range of human rights. And you know, although you have the typical, I would say, core human rights issues like living income or freedom of association, we also cover in terms of like interlinkages, a lot of rights that are very much linked with environmental issues like access to water and sanitation of local communities, or land rights of small-scale farmers. So this is something that we've been doing for a number of years. Now, for us, the next frontier of these human rights impact assessments is waste management. This is for us, as you know, like an important topic. Plastic waste is something that is very at the heart of our business activities, and we want to dedicate the resources that are necessary for us to better understand the dynamics in this sector and what we can do about it. And of course, we all know that as part of this waste management issue, waste pickers and waste collectors play a very important role. And this is really part of also where our approach to due diligence, I think, really like moving from a very focused approach to core human rights issues to integrating our human rights program into climate change strategies, plastic strategies, deforestation approach. So this is really where we want to go next, based on the experience we've acquired so far. So we made a specific commitment on plastic that by 2025, 100% of our packaging will be recyclable or reusable, with a particular focus on avoiding plastic waste. This forms part of a long-term vision that no one of our packaging, including plastics, ends up in a landfill or as litter, including in the oceans, lakes, and rivers. However, we know that in order to tackle the plastic waste crisis, our commitment to make 100% of our packaging recyclable or reusable alone is not enough. The main challenge for us is really to reduce the use of virgin plastics, and we aim to do so by 1/3 by 2025. And to do so, we will, of course, like invest on research and development. We need to look for novel plastic solutions. But a big chunk of this solution, a big part of this solution, is also going to be led by shifting from virgin plastics to food-grade recycled plastics. And this is really where collection and sorting of waste comes in. And this is really like where waste pickers, like around 15 million waste pickers in the world, play a very core and instrumental role in our strategy. And this is really where we want to look for new types of partnerships with local authorities and waste picker organizations. I think it's widely recognized that waste pickers play a very important role there, that they are like better than anyone else or any type of like technology to do this work, and they are really like part of the solution that we are looking for. Research also shows that where there is work that is recognized, that is a bit formalized by waste pickers, that also like improves their working and living conditions. So this is really something that we want to explore further. So integrating really these elements into our extended producer responsibility arrangements is something that we want to go for. And we are now piloting different things. One is how to integrate this social / human rights dimension into existing projects. One example of that is the STOP project that we have started in Indonesia back in 2017. But the other aspect is also to, as I said before, conduct specific dedicated human rights impact assessments in waste management. And for that, we have 4 pilots now that we are running in 4 different countries. These are Ecuador, Egypt, US, and the Philippines. And as part of these impact assessments, we really want to cover the full waste management value chain. So covering recycling facilities, storage points, waste aggregations points, collection points, transporters, segregators, and also, of course, waste pickers and collectors. So there is a specific focus on working conditions, living conditions, child labor, but also responsible recruitment and forced labor that are really like very specific issues to the sector. The objective of all that is really to integrate human rights into our waste management strategy. As I said, this is still very much in work in progress. We are working with a number of organizations on this, including Elevate and the Fair Labor Association. But there is still a great deal to learn here, especially on what are the issues at stake, but even more importantly, how we can actually like work together on this, especially with local authorities and local NGOs. So this is where we are on plastic.
Great. Thanks so much, Jan. That's a lot of information. It sounds like there's a lot of good things going on, and there's also challenges that you face that other businesses might be interested in learning from. So let me maybe turn to our next speaker, Nalini, now, because Jan just mentioned some very important points linked to the informal sector and their contributions to waste recovery and recycling. And Nalini, I know that your passion is really to restore the dignity of these workers in the unorganized waste sector and to improve their access to predictable livelihood, social security, and all of these issues that come with it. So I'd really like to ask you, can you share some good practices of plastic waste management that look at really, future-proofing informal livelihoods, making sure we're not exploiting the service that they are providing, and really helping them, supporting them in the role that they play in reducing plastic pollution? Over to you, Nalini.
Thank you. So I work with a group called Hasiru Dala. I'm one of the co-founders. Hasiru Dala means green force. Waste Picker chose that name because they felt that they are green collar workers and they don't want to be called as waste pickers, but Hasiru Dala. So it means green force. So what our model has always been looking at creating micro entrepreneurs. We have a trust that is a non-profit. That's how we started. We have about 12,000 waste pickers that we work with. And we also have an enterprise, Hasiru Dala Innovation, and that looks at the livelihood while we look at, Hasiru Dala looks at social justice aspect. These 2 models, when we look at, the values have been the same, but the entities are different and it has its own life. But both the groups have been looking at micro entrepreneur model. So micro entrepreneur model actually creates a space to do better and better and better. And that's how you look at, all of us want to really grow and be better at what we do. And that's the interest they have too. And how do we do this is waste management is directly linked, good waste management is directly linked to mitigation of climate change. So that is how we started working. And we have looked at what is a business model. So we looked at how to make them real entrepreneurs, not just for the sake of saying, just do an entrepreneur and get the work done. It's not like that. So we had to work with them to understand that business as usual doesn't work. The way they are picking on the street is not necessarily best, but there are other options to do so. So we had to convert them into people who are collecting on the street to service provider. It's a huge change that we needed to do, and that was the most challenging thing that we did. And and also when you are providing services. For example, all our customers are very happy to sign up with us, saying that, hey, they work with waste pickers, let's do. But once they sign the contract and tomorrow there is no van there to pick up, they don't care whether it is waste pickers group or anybody, and they fight. So that professionalism that we need to build in our people is the most challenging, and we have been successful in it. And HDI, or the Hasrudala Innovation, actually looked at all the business practices and how we have to make it a business that is profitable so that we can survive. Economic, sustainability is very important. We have 3 services. One is with a total waste management, where we actually provide services to the people and businesses of collection of waste. We have event waste management, which is basically looking at how to reduce waste in the events, and we have been extremely successful managing the waste and not sending anything to landfill, whether it is 50 people who have a party in their house or 50,000 people running in a marathon. We have shown it. And within 24 months, the business was EBITDA positive. So it is possible to look at inclusive businesses and also look at businesses that can be sustainable economically. So some of our waste pickers, because I have 5 minutes, I'm going to talk about the impact. So we can, if there is any questions, I can always answer. When we looked at in the last 10 years, we have created about more than 1,000 jobs. We have created more than 100 entrepreneurs, micro entrepreneurs. And there are also many people who are outside this realm that we work with on their social security and so on. So we have used the innate ability of waste pickers who are basically innately entrepreneurial in nature. So we really use that and leverage that. And also the business model. We looked at the business model. There was no business. When we started, people used to throw waste on the street. We had to create from scratch and say, create a market. We did that. And when we wanted to do, the pricing model, there are a lot of discussion happened. When I'm throwing waste out free of cost, now I have to pay for this service. So we had to create an environment how this has to be a paid, because we believe in polluter pay principle. So we had to take our waste pickers through all these the process. And today we have been very successful business too. And micro entrepreneurs themselves are successful. We have more than 40 people who are registered as businesses, the micro entrepreneurs. More than 29 entities have been filing income tax return. These are the people who used to walk on the street, and today they are filing income tax return. Very recently, we have started registering them in India MSME as MSME companies. So what we need to create is actually ecosystem that supports them, ecosystem that handholds them, and ecosystem where investment could be brought. So these are the things that we have to do. And everybody talked about the human rights perspective. So we are supplying to Body Shop the PET bottle. That is, in India, we don't use PET to PET, or recyclable, plastic cannot be used in the food industry. So we had to export it to make that happen. So today, through Body Shop Forum, we are actually sending out material for Body Shop, which ginger shampoo, 15% of that ginger shampoo today is our PET bottle that goes from here. So what I really want to talk and close it. During COVID time, we had a huge problem in India. All the migrants started moving from one city to other. I mean, people have heard about it a lot. So what I wanted to say is no waste pickers from Bangalore moved out. None of them. All the migrants stayed back because of the support system they have been receiving it. And that support system is very, very important for the workers that we work. So finally, basic principles for making it successful. First of all, your model should be economically sustainable. It should be market driven, human or people centric. Leverage the innate ability of the people that will help you reduce the cost in your operations also, and investment in the people to the company of their own. And we have to move towards living wages. Till that such time living wages doesn't come in existence, you have to look at social security and livelihood as two sides of the same coin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nalini, for sharing your experience. I think that was really valuable. I'd like to, I'm sure we'll come back to all of this. There's already questions coming in, so thank you for that. I'd like to turn to Smita now, and I already mentioned, Smita, you work with Social Alpha, and there you focus very much on sort of renewable energy and giving access to energy, building the entrepreneurship of women, giving them increasing inclusion, as well as resilience. So you're really at that sort of crossroads. And I'd like to ask you, as an ecosystem builder and investor in startups working on clean tech solutions, how do you ensure that human rights play a role in decision making? How do you strike that balance between profitability and ensuring a positive social impact?
Thank you. Thanks, Natalie, and thanks for having me here. I'm actually very happy to go after Nalini. Because I'm going to make a strong case for startups and entrepreneurs who are leading from the front, and everything that I'll say you can relate to the kind of struggles, experiences, and success that they've had. It also swells our heart with pride, because Hasirudala and Nalini's company is one of our portfolio companies that we invested on and supported early on, and we've been a part of their journey, and we've seen the kind of efforts that have gone into it. So, Social Alpha, like I said, like you said, Natalie, is more of a mission. We relate to it more as a mission to drive all three: economic growth, social justice, as well as climate action. And, we understand that while there are trade-offs, there is also synergy and there's also complementarity. And we try and, we believe and we try and optimize on the principles of market returns as well as social impact. And these can happen. We've heard from the previous speakers, and there are umpteen number of cases. All we need to do is, as ecosystem builders, choose, be selective, and support them. Now, how do we do that? By choosing the ones like Nalini, or choosing the ones who are entrepreneurs and solution providers who are choosing to work on areas where, like you heard from her, where markets don't exist. So they're creating their own markets. They are working on providing solutions to the underserved so far. They're working on solving problems that have persisted for the longest time. So all of us collectively in all these years haven't managed to solve it. And these are tough nuts to crack, we understand. And they're working in sectors where, the traditional risk-reward ratios don't really work. Right? So it's a huge risk. What we need to do is distribute that risk evenly and not have these solution providers, have to bear the entire brunt of it. So what do we try and do? We have social impact as a very, very strong, criterion, in the selection of startups and the kind of solution providers we work with. Second, you can't bring inclusion and a human rights approach along the way. You have to build it from the start, and it has to be the purpose of what you're doing and why you're doing things. And therefore, we have, we work with a thesis approach where we build and prioritize problem statements from the ground up, and their inclusion and a human rights approach is central to the, to the problems that we select and prioritize. So that helps. Then, also looking at this whole, one challenge with a lot of us and a lot of stakeholders trying to address solutions and provide solutions to the underserved is that we don't look at them as customers in the most typical sense. So our focus is on affordability, accessibility, and more importantly, a high user experience. So we try and work with startups that are trying to understand the concepts of choice, of preference, of aspirations for the segments that they're working with, and not just looking at, making a make-do kind of a approach or solutions toward these communities. And then, finally, one of the very, very important things that has worked for us, and I'd strongly advise it to any investor that's trying to strike the right balance between market returns and social impact, is that there needs to be a four-lens kind of a focus. So while prosperity and wellness have to be very important, particularly in the, more so in the post-COVID era to build resilience, there has to be a strong focus on sustainability and equity. And without all these four lenses put together, whether it's investment, whether it is, stakeholders trying to build programs and drive inclusion, it's very, very difficult. We also try and look for the right partners, because while you address the solution provider side of the story, you're also there's also responsibility to look at the demand side and help them anchor these solutions on the ground. So you need the right grassroots network partners. You need the right sort of partners that can work on demand aggregation and awareness creation. So all of these things are important. There are several examples of programs that have done that. Unep's Empower that you mentioned early on has been doing that in Vietnam, working with ethnic minorities who also happen to be economically poor. In Bangladesh and Vietnam, they've been doing this. We have recently launched with very like-minded stakeholders a program called Sustain Plus, where we are trying to look at decentralized renewable energy as the means for poverty alleviation. And there's several examples of programs in India and elsewhere where decentralized renewable energy, more so because it has the versatility. It's not just power from the grid, which comes at its own costs and its own infrastructure. It's more of a distributed, decentralized, and versatile and flexible power source, which can be inclusive, which has the scope for being contextualized to solutions better, which can actually empower and at the same time be viable. Which is why decentralized renewable energy and going through the entrepreneurial and innovation route is something that we will want to make a strong case for. Maybe I'll pause there and see if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Smita. You've given us a lot of food for thought. I would have one very, very short follow-up question. Maybe your answer can also be quite concise. So you've alluded to this already, but how can investing in these renewable energy solutions, for instance, decentralized energy, how can that really empower communities and protect their rights and interests? I think you're still muted, Smita.
Sorry about that.
There you go.
So access to energy is a leveler, right? Because lack of access to energy, we've seen, adds to the cycle of marginalization, deprivation, and poverty. And access to energy has the power to break through that. And like I was saying, renewable energy is more versatile to look at the kind of geographical barriers, economic, social barriers, and can and create more self-reliant solutions for communities. We have umpteen examples of startups and solution providers that are looking at decentralized renewable energy based livelihood generation. When you look at income augmentation, when you look at self-reliant solutions for communities, that also builds resilience, that builds local capacities, and that moves you towards a more equitable growth paradigm. At the end of it, it's a seesaw. If we don't, some of the earlier speakers have very well articulated, if we don't balance the seesaw, the positives are always going to skew towards the few, and there will be selected socially and economically marginalized sections that will, always have to bear the brunt of the negative impacts. I hope that answers your question, Natalie.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Smita. We also have more questions rolling in for you, so we'll get back to you later. But for now, I'd like to move on to our last panelist, last but not least, of course, Ms. Miyuki Zuniya from Daiichi Life Insurance. Miyuki-san, we've heard a few examples already of responsible business practices and activities. Can you tell us from an investor perspective, why is business action that addresses human rights and environmental matters as part of their risk management processes? Why is this so important, and why does it maybe make good business sense from an investor perspective?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's very pleased to be here on a virtual conference. This is the first time for me to join this conference. Okay. First of all, I'd like to introduce our companies. The Dijkstra Corporation, Dijkstra is based in Tokyo, as you know, and we have over 100 years history. And in Japan, we have more than 10 million customers in Japan. And also the total assets of us is 35 trillion yen assets. And so as a long-term investor and asset owner of this asset, risk management is one of the key themes for us to evaluate the company's governance. Especially, we are a life insurance company and are taking care of human life for a long term, and we have to show our resilience. In that means, we are carefully watching what the companies would respond to tackling the pandemic. Since 2017, when we agreed a stewardship code in Japan, we have done lots of engagement with companies. I would like to introduce one leading food company which understands the importance of caring environmental matters and human rights. The company's name is Ajinomoto. Dijkstra has been one of the large shareholders of Ajinomoto and has been a long relationship with Ajinomoto. When I visited 4 years ago as an engagement with the senior executive director, we had talked about responsible business, including business and human rights as a global food company. They have already understood the importance, and at the same time, they were so surprised that institutional investors like us was already interested in the business and human rights. If you would see their website, you could find also how they responded to COVID-19. And also, I would like to introduce another example, Kao Corporations, whose company was selected as one of the most honored companies among household, cosmetics, and personal care sector. Dijkstra also has a long relationship with Kao and made lots of dialogue, especially on ESG integration into management strategy. I believe, as you see, it is very important to explain how institutional investors like us are watching about the company's behavior related with business and human rights. And I believe that we should tell the companies that we would evaluate their activities into company valuation. And is it possible to explain what is going on in Japan about National Action Plan? One of the working group members for National Action Plan by Japanese government since last April, I've explained the importance of integrating sustainability, including business and human rights, into Japanese stewardship code or corporate governance code. In this March, the revised Japanese stewardship code has been finalized, and it used the first time the sustainability or ESG factors at the first time, and asked institutional investors to make dialogue with the corporations, including ESG factors. Regarding the National Action Plan by Japanese government, the steering committee to finalize National Action Plan will be held in July after considering public comments. And working member for National Action Plan have released the second request paper for National Action Plan and hope the final one would be released thinking of COVID-19 pandemic. This is the situation of National Action Plan in Japan. At the same time, we should explain one thing. The steering committee of this national plan is run by Ministry of Foreign Affairs. On the other hand, regarding climate change or environment matters, Ministry of Environment is in charge of climate action with a collaboration with METI. This is another hurdle in Japan. So as a result, at this moment in Japan, only few companies or few investors will take consideration human rights with the interlinkage of environment. However, as a member of a global compact in Japan, I have joined the seminars to explain what global institutional investors are watching to evaluate the company. And also, as an advisory committee member of a PRI Japan, I have joined a working study group for knowledge sharing among Japanese institutional investors for engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miyuki, for giving us that perspective from sort of an investor view, and also for sharing what is going on in Japan in terms of the National Action Plan. We will get back to you and to others in the Q&A, but I'd like to now give the opportunity to my colleague Stephanie Venuti from OECD to share some of the work that she is doing together with colleagues. So Stephanie, you lead the OECD Center's thematic work on environment, climate change, and responsible business conduct. So in your role, can you explain to us how businesses can be better supported in understanding, identifying, addressing these linkages between human rights and environmental risks and impacts? And I know that OECD has developed some guidance and support for due diligence here. So it would be really great to hear how you address these concerns.
Sure. Thanks, Natalie, for the question. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel and hear about all these different experiences from the different panelists. So I found that really interesting. Thank you very much. I want to take this opportunity to just follow up and reiterate on a couple of different topics that have actually been raised by some of the different speakers. And going back to Surya's introduction and the framing of this session, I wanted to turn a little bit back again to the international guidance on responsible business conduct, and in particular the OECD instruments that have been mentioned. So the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises provide recommendations from governments to business on how businesses should be positively contributing to sustainable development, whilst importantly at the same time mitigating adverse impacts and risks to people and then the environment. Two key points I want to raise about the guidelines in the context of today's discussion is that firstly, they're comprehensive in nature, which means that they cover all areas of business risk and responsibility and include, for example, a dedicated chapter on the environment and a dedicated chapter on human rights, amongst other areas of risk as well. The second point I want to make is that they are backed by almost 50 governments globally now and have been informed and developed by governments, business, NGOs, trade unions. So they really represent international consensus and a recognized language around what is business responsibility. They also include a recommendation that businesses should carry out supply chain due diligence, and we've heard about that already. And the OECD has developed guidance on what is this supply chain due diligence. Particularly, it's that guidance also recommends that businesses use a comprehensive approach to assessing their risk management, and so approach that takes into account all the different areas of their responsibilities, so all the different areas that are covered by those guidelines. So it embodies an approach that enables businesses to be really looking at those interlinkages between human rights and the environment. But of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't more work to be done in this space. And we've heard about some of the challenges, and we've also heard from Surya that perhaps these interlinkages aren't always as explicit as they should be. In terms of the practical aspects of this work, I just wanted to make a quick reference to the national contact points for responsible business conduct. So national contact points, or NCPs, are set up by governments that have adhered to the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And national contact points are responsible for promoting the guidelines and also providing a mediation or reconciliation platform for cases where a business may not have observed their responsibilities as outlined in the OECD guidelines. So when we look at the range of NCP cases that have been filed, the majority of cases that relate to environmental matters almost always also cite the human rights chapter of the guidelines. So that's a very clear indication of the interlinkages between these two areas of responsibility. And those cases often tend to focus on environmental impact assessments, meaningful stakeholder engagement, and impacts on Indigenous communities. So in terms of going back to this sort of question of gaps and opportunities and further support that can be provided, this is certainly an area that the OECD is engaging on, and in my work in particular, we're looking at practical actions that businesses can take in taking some of these guidances and recommendations forward in terms of their risk management processes. So really starting to look more at how the due diligence approach should be applied in practice when you're looking at, in particular, environmental challenges and global environmental challenges that businesses are facing. And of course, that needs to include the human rights dimensions of that. We know that a lot of synergies and lessons can be learned from human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence processes. But what is really important is that we ensure that those two processes are interlinked and de-siloed within a business. And that's some of the topics that the business panelists have already actually talked about, how they're going about in doing that. But I think this issue is going to become increasingly important and relevant, particularly when we look at international trends now around mandating for or regulating for mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. So we're really going to see more and more the interplay between these two areas of business risk and responsibility. And it's certainly an area that the OECD is engaging quite closely, and we're looking forward to continuing to collaborate with our partners, including Unep, in taking this work forward and also taking on board some of the outcomes of this consultation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I think it's really important to hear that there is a lot of work that is being done, and there is guidance out there, and there's, sort of practical steps that businesses can follow when they're faced with these challenges and questions. So thank you for sharing that with us. I think that's quite relevant. So that would conclude sort of our first round of panel discussion, and also thank you to all of our speakers for the information and experience you've shared. What we'd like to do now, as I mentioned, is we're going to invite all of you in the audience to engage in our Mentimeter discussion. So we have 3 questions that we'd like to ask you through Mentimeter. You can find the link in the chat, or you can visit menti.com and type in the code 882703. So you can join our Mentimeter discussion. So we're going to have some of the results up here already. You'll see live results coming in. Just connect with your mobile phones or some other device. And the first question is, how good is your understanding of environmental rights and the responsibilities of businesses to ensure such rights are protected? And there's a little slider there. You can be quite honest. It's all anonymous, not good, sort of intermediate, moderate, very good. Let us hear from you how good your understanding is of these issues. I'll give this a few minutes because a few people are still providing their feedback. Wow, it looks all right. Sort of a little bit more than average towards good, I'd say. I hope that during this session, you've gained a better understanding of how these issues are linked. So we'll give it another minute. A few people are still logging on to Mentimeter and giving their results. It's jumping a bit. All right, we're at 42 now. So this is looking, around the sort of moderate. Most people say they have a moderate understanding of these issues. Quite a few not so good, but a few seem to also have a very good understanding of these issues. So it's a very mixed field, which is quite interesting. Let's go to the next question then. So in the next question, we'd like to know, in your business or your day-to-day work, are human rights and environmental risks relevant? This is a very simple yes or no question. And again, be very honest if you think it's relevant or not. We are not going to call anyone out. Everything is anonymous. All right, I'm seeing quite a cluster on the yes, but also a few no's. So there seem to be a few thoughts that this is not so relevant depending on your area of work. Right, we had just over 40 respondents before, so we'll give it just another minute there. A few of you are still contemplating. That's all right. I think this is quite an overwhelming yes, although there are a few people who do not directly maybe work on these issues or don't feel that they are very relevant in their day-to-day work. Let's move on to the last question then. So what are the key focus areas where your business addresses human rights and environmental risks? So this is in particular for people who answered yes before. If you don't think that there are any key focus areas, you can also just write none. So this is a word cloud. Feel free to just add a few words, those areas where your business really tries to address human rights and environmental risks. So this could be, climate change. It could be on supply chain management, anything that you're aware of. Interesting field here. And just because it's none now, that doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. So it's absolutely fine to just give us whatever comes to mind. All right, there's a lot of movement now. See a few overlaps. Circular economy, supply chain, and climate change issues seem to be up there. But none is also quite a big category, so that's interesting. All right, still a lot of movement. I can still see climate change, supply chain, pollution, gender, poverty, waste, circular economy. So quite a few very strongly linked areas, also linked to the discussions that we just had on pollution and climate change. But also a few others like early childhood education. I see biodiversity, labor management, fisheries. All right, I think we'll stop it here. I see there's still a little bit of movement, but this is quite interesting. So this really highlights some of the issues that we've already picked up as well, looking at your supply chains, looking at your climate impact, a few things that we haven't really gone into as well, like biodiversity conservation, but then of course, gender issues, education, all of these things are popping up. But I do see there's also quite a big category of none. So even if some people have said this is important, they don't seem to necessarily know in which area their business might already be addressing these issues. So this is quite interesting. Thank you for joining our little Mentimeter survey there. And now I'd actually like to hand over to my colleague, Ms. Katja Chirici, who's the Deputy Director of the Regional Office of UNOHCHR here in Bangkok. And I'd like her to react also to some of these results that we just saw. Katja, we saw that most participants sort of have a moderate understanding of these issues, and it was quite mixed in terms of this is important, but we don't really know what we are doing on this, or, you know, there was quite a mixed bag. Maybe you can give us a little bit more information on, you know, civil society and environmental human rights defenders, how they play a key role in raising awareness of these linkages, and how you think businesses could engage with these actors to address human rights and environmental risks in their business activities. Over to you, Katja.
Yes, thank you, Natalie. And I'm very happy to address this question, in particular, after having heard the rich views of the panelists, but also the very interesting feedback provided by those who are following this discussion. So I think definitely an important starting point is to emphasize that the full enjoyment of human rights depends on a healthy environment. And I think the last question we had now on Mentimeter really highlighted how those rights are also interlinked and interdependent, cutting across all the various aspects of our own lives. Now, from that perspective, of course, environmental human rights defenders, activists, and civil society more broadly play a crucial role in highlighting that nexus and bringing it to the fore of every discussion which is linked to business and human rights and the impact on human rights. And this is even more critical as we look now at the recovery phase of COVID-19 and building back better. The UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, as also Professor Surya reminded us at the beginning of this discussion, clearly states that the process of assessing the adverse impact of human rights business operation should involve meaningful consultation with those potentially affected groups and any other relevant stakeholders. And I think here the key word is meaningful. Several speakers mentioned the importance of human rights due diligence processes, and here it's important to emphasize that the key feature of human rights due diligence is to assess the risks which are linked to the impact on the rights of people and not the risks faced by businesses. So again, putting the rights of those who are affected at the core of any of these considerations. And engaging constructively and in good faith with critical voices, which of course involves environmental human rights defenders, helps businesses to identify those risks, but it will also in turn improve the quality of any human rights due diligence process undertaken. This process will also allow businesses to identify adverse impacts which might otherwise not be known or identified. And it can also, another important aspect, it can also help building trust with affected communities, so that can be the space to work together on solutions and avoiding then the escalation of grievances. Of course, building trust requires that sufficient time is allocated to this process, and also that the strategies devised would help ensuring that those invisible voices are heard, and in particular, of course, the voices of those who are more vulnerable and marginalized. And again, this is a critical aspect when we look at the building back better phase, which is ahead of us. I would just like to end by emphasizing the how in this region the situation of environmental human rights defenders is of particular concern, with Asia, which has been recorded as the second most dangerous region in the world for environmental human rights defenders. So it is really critical for companies to acknowledge the protection challenges faced by civil society and environmental human rights defenders, and also to make sure that whether directly or indirectly, they're not playing a role in silencing those very much needed voices, including, for instance, by using lawsuits to silence their voices. And because indeed they're looking at a precious halai, which can enable a human rights conduct of their own work, and voices which again remind us on a daily basis, and oftentimes with very high prices, which can amount to their lives, of the importance to retain a healthy environment, and also the impact on climate change and human rights in our own daily lives.
Great, thank you so much, Katja. I think the video froze just a little bit towards the end, but most of it we got. And thank you for all of that information. I think that was really valuable. Actually, I would like to ask you a follow-up question, because you just mentioned, the importance of protecting environmental rights defenders, and also making sure that those businesses who really are moving ahead and taking these issues into account, that that they are also protected and they don't sort of face any disadvantages because they might be taking these additional risks. Are there maybe some, specific resources or guidelines or, places where these businesses and civil society actors can go if they, seek protection and advice, if they are taking these additional risks? You're still muted, I think, Katja, but we can resolve that.
Sorry, yes. Thanks, Natalie. Absolutely, I think there is no shortage of important guidance, whether it's from a normative framework, of course, aside from the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights. Some speakers mentioned the mandate, which is critical here, of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, through which important guidance has been developed. The Special Rapporteur also on human rights and the environment produced a number of important guidance tools, including the former Special Rapporteur on environment, which released 16 very useful framework principles, which look at the situation of environmental human rights defenders, and again, they're providing some very concrete and valuable guidance. I think the issue we have is not one of shortage of guidance tools, whether it's from a normative framework or from a policy perspective, but we're rather looking at their effective implementation. And of course, there is always scope for more of that discussion to happen to see how we can also look at existing good practices, not just here in our region, but also taking inspiration from other regions. But the key issue here is working effectively together on their implementation, in our view.
Thank you so much, Katja. That's really valuable. All right, we've had a couple of questions pour in already through our Q&A. So I will go ahead and take a few of these. Apologies if we can't get to all of your questions. So there was one for Nalini. What are some steps policymakers can take to create the supportive ecosystem for informal workers? You know, it's not just up to you and your great organization, but what can other actors also do?
So we have worked extensively with the policy. Solid waste management is also a local government issue. And we created a demand among the citizens for better service. We created a demand for better policies for the officers, which will help them implement. And of course, the workers were organized. So when I started my career with waste pickers in 1993, waste pickers themselves didn't see themselves as workers. They always said, oh, I'd work in dirt, and I'm, you know, from scheduled caste or the caste systems. They were then the lower rung of the caste system. Many those kind of things. In 2010, when I came back to Bangalore to work, and we showed, and the identity card was for the first time given to waste picker with the signature of commissioner and a logo of the city. That became a huge success. And after that, we worked towards getting it in the law in 2016, solid waste management rules, which specifically says all local government should give ID cards to them, provide the opportunity to run the local MRFs, and they are recognized by the law. So it took a long time, but today you don't have to take in any country long time because they are recognized. Waste pickers are the key, and Jan was also talking about how waste pickers are very important. Even if companies have started talking about the importance of waste picker, it becomes very easy. So it's been a long struggle for us, but we don't have to struggle anymore. They are there.
Well, that's very good to hear, and it's a very positive message. Thank you for that, Nalini. I'll go through a few more questions because they're still pouring in. We have one for Smita, thanking you, first of all, for sharing your insights, and then asking, maybe linked to the decentralized renewable energy project that you were speaking about, but as part of these initiatives, how do you see the role of renewable energy alliances, and specifically they mentioned the International Solar Alliance, taking into account sort of responsible business and human rights elements as part of their business investments? What role can these kind of alliances play to promote these approaches?
Sure, thanks. You know, in terms of the examples that I quoted, I talked about the Unep Empower program. You can look it up online. Talked about, you could visit the Social Alpha website and you'll see all these examples that I kept referring to. And the Sustain Plus program that I was talking about, it's very brand new. So you'll see some, website or some information on it very soon. It's a very good question, and I'm glad that you know, alliances are also stepping in and wanting to know this. So, I mean, very quickly, alliances have the convening power, and therefore, what they can do is they can get resources together, get actors together, get funders together. You know, there's a need for early stage investment. There's a need for more and more players to take the risks early on and support innovation, support entrepreneurs like Nalini and others to do what they're doing and not be burdened with lack of resources, right? What they can also do is encourage, actors that are working on inclusion in the entire value chain. So not just, at the consumer end, but also involving, like, Nalini's example and some of the others that are working in including women and more marginalized, communities into the process of delivery of service as well as consumption. So I think in terms of bringing together a more cohesive effort, alliances like ISA can play a huge role. Yeah.
Thank you, Smita. That's really great. We have a question here that's quite specific. And I'd actually like to ask Jan to answer this question first, and then I see that Surya is also interested in answering it. So the question is, what in your experience, how can you bring to the fore, or make it important that this interlinkage between climate change and human rights, or maybe also other environmental issues and human rights, is seen by the board of directors of companies, or further senior management, that they see these interlinkages and that they take ownership to address them? What is your experience in making that happen? And maybe there's specific resistance there. Jan, maybe you could share the experience from your company or other companies that you might be aware of.
Thanks. As I said before, this is really the next step in our approach to human rights due diligence. And I mentioned the fact that we're now integrating human rights into climate change strategies and waste management strategies. This is the next frontier, really. We've done a lot of work on human rights due diligence per se so far, and now we're trying really to de-silo, actually, to Stephanie's point, de-silo actually these two areas and see where the connections are. I talked about plastics, but there are a lot of other examples, like the link between smallholders and deforestation is another one, or access to water and sanitation, as I mentioned before. So there are a lot of different examples where this synergy can happen. I think where we need to be innovative as companies is to be able to combine what is required more and more from us from a due diligence perspective, but also come up with innovative solutions. And this is where these partnerships with waste picker organizations, with this entrepreneurship mindsets really helped.
Thanks so much. And I saw that Professor Surya Deva, you also wanted to answer that question. Please go ahead if you want to add anything to that.
Thanks. No, I will just briefly add that some companies have started making this connection at the highest level in the board of directors. And I think sometimes the pressure is coming from investors, or it could be because of the sectors in which they're operating. They already see the risk, not only for the stakeholders, but also for the business. But my point will be that it is crucial to understand that the company should act, whether it is a risk for them or not. Because what we are looking at here is risk to the people, planet. And if the activities of business are already creating that risk, climate change must come to the top shelf. It is not there yet for most of the companies. And I think we need to change this corporate culture, but we need to bring this upwards to the top shelf where it becomes normal for each company to consider this. Otherwise, I think we will face a serious crisis in coming years. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. I also have a question for Miyuki-san. You mentioned to us that businesses really need to have a look at this, because this is going to become increasingly important also for investment in terms of considering what companies are actually sustainable longer term. So what would you see as sort of the top issue, or what are maybe some of the most prevalent issues that pop up that investors should address to really also promote this with businesses, that they look at human rights and the environment? What is maybe, if you could only do one thing, what is it that you would do, or what area would you focus on?
Thank you very much. Actually, after the pandemic, we can realize the company's vision is really or fake. So we can select, we are going on a selection of which company we should invest. So when we do a lot of engagement with senior directors, we can understand what they really think about the materiality of their business and related with ESG factors. So I think this is a good timing for us to realize. And also, we have, as an investor, we have to make a lot of deep engagement with companies on the topics. Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So this in June is a General Assembly season in Japan. So after, from next month, we start engagement with the companies. And we do a lot of engagement based on this human rights and environment. Maybe at that period, the National Action Plan will be released, finalized in Japan also. So that's a good timing, I think. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Miyuki-san. So we are sort of getting close to the end of our session. I have one more question to Smita. So you're very popular, Smita, where specifically someone asked, businesses and government, they have a big role, obviously, in protecting the rights of people and ensuring there's the right environment for due diligence. But engaging marginalized groups is very crucial. All of us have said this, stakeholder engagement. But if some of these people are, quite disadvantaged and they're struggling, especially at the moment with COVID-19, with, other issues, how do we really meaningfully engage them, like Katja said? How do we really do that without an additional burden to them?
Well, thank you. I think, it's a very, it's an appropriate question to ask. And the idea is that we have to move beyond the paradigm of provisioning and move towards, engaging. The solutions have to be better contextualized. They have to engage people and be designed with their, requirements. And I earlier spoke about preference, aspirations, choice. All of these elements have to factor in. And there has to be inclusion of communities that have historically and structurally been marginalized. We owe it to them to include them in the entire value chain. So, there has to be a shift from, and as pointed out, businesses and governments have this responsibility, but all of us, no matter what role do we play in this ecosystem, have the responsibility to move from this whole, paradigm of provisioning to engaging.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. So we're getting sort of close to the end. I do have one more question, Professor Surya, if you can answer it very, very briefly. Human rights violations and child labor are expected to increase with the sort of economic issues that are caused by COVID-19. So how do you think companies will be able to apply these correct due diligence measures beyond tier 1 suppliers?
I think I already answered this question through the chat box, but I'll quickly repeat that I think it is crucial that the businesses work with their entire supply chain, all the business partners. They should work with trade unions, civil society groups. They should provide workers safe space to communicate directly. So there are a number of tools available by which they can engage and do this. But if I could quickly respond to Serena's question about corruption in due diligence, can I? Serena, thanks for waiting. Again, I have several responses for that. I think it is crucial to involve local people, do due diligence at the early stage, because later on it is getting fixed. It is also crucial that the government should not outsource their responsibility to supervise due diligence. And there has to be accountability of bad due diligence. So if a company or a consultant has done bad due diligence, there should be accountability for that. So we need regulation of even consultants who are doing the BHR work in future. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I'd like to sort of summarize a few of the things that we've heard. I won't be able to summarize everything, but we had really great information from all of the speakers. Dr. Surya, Professor Surya, you basically just summarized what you said yourself, but basically there are a lot of instruments out there. There is guidance that we can use. And Sarah as well, thank you so much for highlighting how we are all connected to our ecosystems and to the environment and how we depend on their health for our own enjoyment of human rights. And Jan as well, it's really good to hear that you are starting this kind of de-siloing of these areas, environment and human rights, and how this can really make business sense as well. Thank you for sharing your examples in this field. And that also how important it is to engage waste pickers in improving waste management. Nalini, I think that was really, really interesting to hear, how you are working with waste pickers. Some of the takeaways for me was really that you said you need to build this kind of support system, an ecosystem that really builds on the knowledge and the interest that people already have, and that it needs to make business sense. We need to have a real model so that this works. And Smita as well, along the sort of similar lines, this idea of moving beyond this, provisioning and always just providing something for these groups, but rather to look at really smart solutions that build and empower and build independence for better livelihoods. Yuki as well, really great perspective on how investors are looking at these issues now, and it's really smart for businesses and for companies to understand these interlinkages because this will become increasingly important for investments in the future. Thank you as well to Stephanie for sharing what OECD is already doing in this area. So there is guidance out there. The role of national contact points, that was really enlightening, and to see that human rights and environmental cases are very often linked. So it's very clear that these linkages are there. Katya as well, thank you for your intervention on highlighting again how we depend on a healthy environment as well. So what I'd like to do now, we have just a little bit of time left, is I'd like to give all of you the opportunity to sort of make one final statement. If you can keep it to one sentence, that would be really amazing. Let's see if we can do that. I'd like to first start with our panelists, actually. Jan, over to you if there's a final sentence you'd like to share with us.
I just would like to emphasize what I said before, that of course there is a lot of guidance out there, and this is really, really helpful, starting with the guiding principles or the OECD guidelines, but it really gets much more complicated when it comes to remediation. And I think it was highlighted before by others that the remediation work is very important, and this is really where we need to be innovative, and this is really where collaboration is important. And I think we could see from this panel discussion that this collaboration is taking place, but much more work is needed there. So I'll leave it there. I think it's important, but remediation is really where the challenges are.
Thank you that's really good food for thought, I think, as well. Nalini, over to you if you have a sort of final sentence for us.
Yeah, people-centric businesses are most important, and inclusion be paired with a business model that work so that we are sustainable.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Smita?
Yeah, I'd say, collectively, let's plug the blind spots. Let's back the champions who are providing solutions, help, de-risk some of their interventions in the most underserved segments.
Great. Thank you also for mentioning this issue of de-risking again. Yuki-san, please, if you want to give a final sentence.
Thank you. There is a word of sampo yoshi in Japanese words. Sampo means the three directions. The one is society, and one is people, and one is economy. In Japanese period, the three balance is very important. So now is the time to show sampo yoshi in Japan. Thank you.
Great. I'm not sure whether we have the time, but Sarah, you haven't said anything in a while. If you want to share one last sentence, then we can finish with that.
Just how much I have enjoyed hearing all these different perspectives, and in particular, the importance of hearing the social enterprise bottom-up engagement with environmental human rights is crucially important to these problems. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, all of you, for being our speakers, and thank you to everybody for joining this session. Please go and have a look at some of the other side events that are out there. Thank you so much. And if you have any more questions, get in touch with us, and have a fantastic weekend, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.